The Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spagnola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. Today it's just me. I'm everyday folks, and here I am, as always, broadcasting for the past 10 years. Like since 2014, my friends. It's like wild to me how long I've been doing this. I've definitely never had a hobby that kept me interested as long as this podcast has. I'm your host, Carmen Spagnola, joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, recently known as Victoria, BC, Canada. Welcome to my Witches New Year retreat, my friends. Of course, this is a podcast, so you could be listening to this at any time of year, not necessarily Halloween, Samhain, which is the Witches' New Year. But I had this idea that I would create a podcast series that you could listen to as a personal spiritual retreat, especially to honor the season of the witch, the season of Samhain, the season of the beloved dead, the festival that leads us into the dark half of the wheel of the year. This episode goes out to all the history buffs, but especially the ones who are fascinated by the witch hunts and the burning times, the ones who stan Silvia Federici, those armchair theology nerds like myself, and the literary types and the folks who enjoy feminist reclaiming. I'm sure listeners of the Numinous Podcast have probably heard of the Great Courses. This session is very much inspired by all the classes I've taken through the Great Courses. If you've never heard of the Great Courses, it's an online learning company. They came on the scene in the early 2000s. And if you remember that time, it was after the internet had started and been around for a little while, but before the TED Talks era, where online education was sort of edutainment, So back then, it was just a catalog of correspondence courses that you would just audit. You wouldn't get marked on. Do you remember correspondence courses? Is that a term that anyone under Gen X knows? I did a correspondence course when I was in high school. And so what you would get was a textbook and a box full of cassette tapes and a journal or with worksheets. And you'd do all your work and you'd physically mail them back. And then they would physically get marked and returned back to you by your professor. That's how I learned rudimentary Italian before I went backpacking through Europe when I was 17. I stayed in a month in Torino. I don't know why it felt important to tell you that. I digress. I'm thinking a lot about my life because I just turned 49. Anyway, so the Great Courses would record university lectures by the world's leading experts in their subject matter. And you would get to audit these really in-depth courses. And the Great Courses would either ship you CDs or DVDs or cassettes, whatever you asked for. And then eventually, of course, they started offering MP3s. And now I think they're basically a streaming service, although my in-laws still get a physical catalog. I've taken so many courses now through them. And of course, it's the podcasting age. So you can get a bunch of their courses through Audible. I've taken dozens. I tend to gravitate towards the history courses, philosophy, theology, a little bit of writing. There's two that really stand out to me. One, I highly recommend the one called The History of Heresy. Fantastic, fascinating, loved it. The other one that was so interesting was called What is Evil? Or was it, Does Evil Exist? Why does evil exist? Why does evil exist? Something like that. Anyway, it was a course on evil. Fascinating. Anyway, this is dangerous for me to kind of do episodes off the cuff. But thanks for coming along for the ride. This episode of my Witches New Year miniseries is actually going to feature a mini lecture on the history of intuition and divination from a Western perspective. And it's actually a recording, an excerpt from the opening class of an old program I used to have, a year-long intuition development course called the Numinous School. So I've just edited this little clip. There was preamble before, and then like trance work came after. But I just wanted to lift this short lecture out because it really does speak to my perspective on why intuition development is so important. Like, what are we doing? This isn't just navel gazing. This isn't just personal development for our own self-actualization, you know? So yeah, it's about why intuition development is important, or more precisely, why is intuition development important specifically when it's from a trauma-informed, attachment-oriented, somatically based, and collapse-aware perspective. Anyway, in this essay, I will show how Thomas Aquinas, due to his early life attachment ruptures and abandonment wound, and under the influence of the violent, toxic masculinity of the Inquisition and Aristotle's earlier writings, became a 23-year-old incel who went on to drive an 800-year wedge between intuition and the mind for people of European descent. Enjoy! So, a brief history of the word intuition. It's not just the etymology, but actual, like, how long has this word been in our English lexicon? Where did it come from? I think it's useful, or at least illustrative. Maybe not useful. You're probably not going to use this at the next, job interview or whatever, but I think it's illustrative to have some background on this. The late medieval period, about the 1200s, there's this guy, Thomas Aquinas, and he is a theologian, and he wrote the Summa Theologica, and in it, he's trying to figure out how angels think. And he determined that there's this deliberate, discursive thinking that humans do, and then there's this visionary thinking where ideas come all at once that he called intuitos. And he said that visionary thinking that comes all at once is what angels do. And he also surmised that angels not only have information about what is happening now, but also they will suddenly have all the information about the past and the future as well. And so this is the first time that this comes into our lexicon. Now, just to, let's put it in some context here. Thomas Aquinas, it's the 1200s. He is taken to a monastery for his education at the age of 5 years old, little boy. So, like, right away, what do we think of that? What do we make of that from an attachment perspective, right? What is the framework? And it doesn't matter that lots of people might have been taken to monasteries at the age of 5. Just think of it from a neurobiological, interpersonal neurobiology, like the bond between people, 5 years old in a monastery. And he was taken to this Benedictine order, and he was there for the first part of his childhood. And so who are the Benedictines? If I say Thomas Aquinas is a Benedictine monk, there's some things that would come with that. So the Benedictines were the ones who, they had, like St. Benedict had these rules of order, and like what he thought should happen. And one was labor in service of the community. The other one was song and scripture as a way to try to hear God speaking to you. And so because they had these scriptoriums, they were the ones who kind of really pushed the whole illuminated manuscript thing. So they're singing, they're working together, they're drawing, they're the artsy guys, okay? Then when he's like 13, he switches into this other monastery, and then he goes to university. And in university, he starts studying Aristotle. So Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. Who's the worst? Aristotle. Aristotle, the one who said that by nature, mothers in particular, but women in general, play a passive material role in the life of children and of men, and that men perform the ensoulment role for the human species, meaning men have a soul and women don't. And so the other thing so he's studying with Aristotle, and the other thing that happens is the Roman Inquisition is just kicking off. And who do they recruit as their folks? It's the Dominicans. And the Dominican order is all about intellectualism and scholarship. And so Thomas Aquinas loves that shit. He, after university and all this Aristotle stuff, becomes a Dominican. And guess who they are? They are the strong arm of the Inquisition. So I'm just telling you this so that we have a sense of, like, language comes from the land. The word intuitos already comes with a particular perspective and lens on that. So it's fraught. It's fraught. Fast forward a couple hundred years to the Renaissance, and John Milton writes Paradise Lost. And today scholars would say that John Milton was second only to Shakespeare in terms of how influential he's been as a writer on the formation of Western culture. So Milton is like kind of forgot about today because he basically wrote a piece of biblical propaganda, Paradise Lost, and we've kind of shifted away from that. However, he was political. In Paradise Lost, he's talking about the story of the war for heaven and man's expulsion from Eden. And he really paints a vivid picture of Satan. And he doesn't mean to make him like appealing, but because of the sort of revolutionary atmosphere that was fomenting at that time, a lot of people identified with Satan. And of course, this is where we get the line, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. And so anyway, so there's this scene in Paradise Lost where Adam, the first man, is talking to Archangel Raphael, and they're having lunch, and Raph basically says there's like there's human reason, which is rational, and angelic reason, which is intuitive. And so that's the first time this shows up, and now the word intuition is fixed in mainstream lexicon, and the separation between human and the divine is anchored into the Western psyche. And we inaugurate the beginning of the Age of Reason, also known as the Enlightenment, which is basically when they decided that given enough time, every mystery could be explained. And so then scientific rationalism finds its way into spiritual inquiry. And the gap between man and the divine, human and the divine, human and the earth, human in nature, human in the body, gets wider and wider and wider. And of course, this lines up perfectly with just the height of the witch hunts and the burning times and the Inquisition, which really had a peak from the 1500s to 1700s. Anyway, so today we could probably agree that the utility of applying the scientific method to spiritual inquiry definitely has its limits. John Michael Greer, former archdruid in the US, he would say you're using the wrong tools to solve the problem. You wouldn't consult a scientific text to understand intuition and magic any more than you would consult the Bible to understand evolution or geography. So we still don't know for sure how intuition works, but we have at least 100 years of research and evidence that that is indicating that it does work. And Peter Struck, who's a classicist who writes academic publications about all kinds of things of the ancient Greek world, but in particular divination, he says that intuition is one of those things that's hard to deny and hard to explain. It's hard to deny and it's hard to explain. And our ability to know exceeds our ability to understand how we know. Our ability to know exceeds our ability to understand how we know. So it's a paradox. We love paradoxes. It's because it circumvents the conscious mind. We can't figure it out. But what we do know also, though, is that no matter our heritage, and whether we know our heritage or not, we know that our ancestors all believed that surplus knowledge exists. Surplus knowledge that we don't know how we know it, but it's like out there and available to us in the ether. So all people in all times, we have come to understand, believed that surplus knowledge was available, that surplus knowledge was very compelling and provocative and often very useful. And we know that they created tools and techniques to help them grasp the surplus, like pluck it from the ether. And so there are now a million different ways, probably millions of ways, just local variants on the techniques used to grasp the surplus knowledge. And there are innumerable ways to acquire it, organize it, standardize it, transmit it. You can read cards, you can read smoke, you can read fire, you can read eggs cracked in water, you can read dreams, you can read animal scat. Like there's just something, the land inspired people everywhere to figure out ways to acquire and standardize and transmit the surplus knowledge. And so here's the thing to just come back to again. Magic isn't about perfection of the technique. So yes, we're going to learn techniques in this class, but the magic doesn't come from perfecting the technique. It comes from relationships. And so the strength of your relationship with the spirits of place, the spirits of the other world, the spirits of this world, those will form the foundation of your skill as a diviner, as a ritualist, as a witch, as a mage. And so since it's about relationships and relating, I will often talk about attachment, because your attachment stuff comes up when you're trying to be in relationship with something more than human. And because your relationship and your experience with your body, which is your conduit, which is your instrument for interpreting what's the state of my relationship with spirit, stuff is going to show up in your capacity to trust, and your sensing of safety, and your perception of threat, or your misperception sometimes of threat. That's going to show up in your relationship too, because it's showing up through the body. It's not a cognitive thing that you can just turn off in your spiritual practice, whatever attachment injuries or traumas of the body you come in with, right? So that's why from time to time, we'll also use somatic trauma recovery practices to assist us with our intuition, our intuitive perception, our gut feelings, our animal presence, and our attachment injuries, and our relationship with our bodies, they actually all come hand in hand. And so we're going to use a lot of techniques to help us go slow and practice cultivating and nurturing a trusting and secure relationship with spirit. That's what we're doing here, is we're trying to cultivate and nurture a trusting and secure relationship with spirit. And so that's going to help us become more comfortable with ambiguity, because we're not always going to understand. And so being comfortable with ambiguity in our lives, or in our emotions, or in our body is a really good transferable life skill. We're going to develop more resilience for confusion and even change, turmoil, chaos. Like that's what happens when we start to become more comfortable with ambiguity and we cultivate this nurturing, trusting relationship with spirit. We do become more resilient. So yay, collapse preparation. Yay, emergency preparedness. And also, this work is going to help us develop a more welcoming orientation towards the unknown other. So a warm hospitality towards difference, until nothing and no one is other to us anymore. Until nothing and no one is othered. So that was a clip from the first class in the Numinous School, my intuition development program, which has been archived, and the sound is better. I don't really understand how the clip lost sound quality there, but I can't figure it out. So hopefully you were able to get through that. But anyway, the full lecture is available as the first class of the Numinous School, which is available through my monthly subscription service, the Numinous Network. I often have people who are like, where do I begin with intuition development? And it's like, you start with the Numinous School. It's a course that is ideal for beginners because it's progressive. It gives you like a really great foundation, and you build on it every month with a 90-minute enrichment class and a 1-hour Q&A, like tutorial. But I would say it also provides a lot of healing for folks who've been in some really not trauma-informed, or like really not culturally competent, or really not collapse-aware or politically aligned spiritual spaces. So from that lens, we cover trance work fundamentals, ancestral veneration and lineage healing, planetary magic and propitiation, plant medicine, like communicating with plants, ritual and ceremony, oracular divination and tarot, past life regression, spiritual hygiene, like so much. So if you're interested in doing a deep dive into spiritual development and intuition development, and you like this manner of approach, come join us in the network. If you like this episode and you want to leave me some feedback, or you have a question for me, you can go to the show notes in your podcast player, or go to numinouspodcast.com for the show notes, and you'll find a link there to leave me some feedback. You can leave a voice note or a written note. Or if you want, you can just go in your browser now to castfeedback.com/numinouspodcast. Okay, my listener shout out today. Thank you so much to fellow podcaster Stoner Story Witch. I think that's the name of the podcast, Stoner Story Witch. She left a 5-star review in Apple Podcasts, so that feels wonderful. And especially from somebody who knows how much work something like this is. She titled it, "What a Gift." I absolutely love Carmen's body of work in the world of attachment, collapse, animism, and witchcraft, all with a radically anti-capitalist, decolonial, and feminist orientation. This podcast features all her greatest hits and more as she digs into the mysteries of life with everyday folks. She's such a warm and thoughtful interviewer, and listening to her podcast is like snuggling under a blanket with a hot cup of tea. I love that. Thank you. Thank you. And go check out Stoner Story Witch podcast. Excellent storytelling and feminist analysis. The episodes I've listened to are about Little Women. From an attachment perspective. Oh my God, so good. Okay, last thing. Hey, if you are an over-functioning caregiver, you are going to want to check out my new gut-directed hypnotherapy program. It's on-demand audio and video. You could totally start today. What I've been hearing from people is that it's like a spa visit for your brain. And I would say more specifically, it's like a spa treatment for your gut-brain axis. But participants have said things like, "Gosh, Carmen Spagnola, I'm 1 week in and it's already having positive impact. My digestion is much improved already. Doing this is making me think that hypnotherapy would be a good path or resource for reducing the trauma imprints and the effects of ADHD and autism. I feel like this hypnosis is really helping, even though it's not designed for that purpose. I guess that's because my digestion issues are likely all due to the chronic, cumulative stress of being neurodivergent in this society. Sigh. Thanks a million, Carmen. You're the real deal." Like, that's amazing. That's awesome. This program is going to help reduce symptoms of fatigue, post-exertional malaise, sleep disturbance, pain, neurological and cognitive issues, as well as autonomic and neuroendocrine and immune manifestations. So basically, if you have any of the 200 symptoms of long COVID, if you have IBS, if you have ME/CFS, I have made this program with you in mind. Also, if you have perimenopause, which is a prolonged chronic brain inflammation state, same kind of thing. So, I highly recommend you come check it out. You can start immediately. And once or twice a month, we have a live connection call in the network for folks with sensitive nervous systems. So if you have any of the symptoms or diagnoses I listed, that's you. You have a sensitive nervous system. And as that participant said, if you're a neurosparkly person, you probably have troubles with digestive issues and sleep. So this program could be for you. Join us in the Numinous Network to get started. You can find out more at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, which will be tomorrow, take care.